Hey guys, tonight we slip into a world where death is not whispered about in hushed tones or hidden behind closed doors. Instead, you trudge through foggy streets where mortality is a constant companion, a specter at every dinner table and shadow on every wallpapered wall. Victorian England, with its gas lamps flickering in the gloom, holds a peculiar and intense fascination with death and the afterlife. You probably won't survive this journey without encountering a corpse, a funeral procession, or perhaps even a seance inviting restless spirits. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Got your location and local time handy? Drop those in the comments. It's always fascinating to see where in the world we're waking up or winding down together. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Death was not just an event in Victorian life. It was woven deeply into the fabric of their existence. The Industrial Revolution brought rapid urbanization, and with it, diseases that claimed lives with brutal efficiency. In an age without antibiotics or modern sanitation, death rates soared, making the loss of a loved one a frequent, if no less painful, occurrence. So much so, that mourning became a public performance, elaborate, stylized, and deeply ritualized. Mourning dresses, black crepe veils, and the chilling beauty of post-mortem photography all spoke to a society both terrified of death and obsessed with memorializing it. The Victorian approach to death was a dance between dread and devotion, between superstition and science. The influence of Christianity provided a framework of hope and resurrection, but alongside it rose spiritualism, a movement that sought to bridge the divide between the living and the dead with seances and mediums. Ghost stories and Gothic literature fed this fascination, painting death both as a fearsome unknown and a doorway to another existence. Historians still argue whether the Victorian/obsession with death was a morbid fixation or a sincere attempt to cope with the overwhelming presence of mortality. Was it a culture steeped in melancholy, or one trying to find solace in rituals and belief? Tonight, as you settle in, you'll witness the complexity of Victorian death culture, a mirror to their deepest fears, their hopes, and their enduring quest to understand what lies beyond the final breath. You wake up in Victorian England. The year is somewhere between 1837 and 1901, and death is more than just a word whispered in feuilletes, a daily reality. As you step outside into the crowded, soot-stained streets, you can almost feel the presence of mortality lurking around every corner. Disease runs rampant in overcrowded cities. Cholera, tuberculosis, and smallpox strike without warning, claiming lives regardless of status. Infant mortality rates hover terrifyingly high. Nearly 1 in 4 children don't make it to their 5th birthday. Death, for Victorians, is not an abstract concept but a grim visitor who often comes knocking early and uninvited. This was a world where funerals were frequent and public affairs, and death's close companionship shaped everything from fashion to architecture. Cemeteries grew larger, and the rituals surrounding death became more elaborate. In the absence of modern medicine, death was swift and often sudden, but also heavily ritualized to provide comfort, control, and social order. The dead were cared for with painstaking attention. Embalming, dressing, and photographing the departed were part of the process of honoring and remembering them. Victorians didn't hide from death, they faced it head-on, yet with a complex, mixture of fear, fascination, and faith. Public health was primitive, and the miasma theory, the belief that disease spread through bad air, held sway until late in the century, which only added to the ominous atmosphere that death was everywhere. As you navigate the foggy streets, you see black veils worn not just as fashion statements, but as symbols of respect and sorrow. Houses display mourning wreaths, and entire communities come together in rituals that mark both loss and remembrance. One of the stark realities of the time was that death didn't discriminate, but the way it was experienced certainly did. The upper classes had access to better medical care and could afford elaborate funerals and memorials, while the poor often suffered in silence, with hastily arranged burials in crowded graveyards. Still, death was a communal experience shared, sorrow that shaped social bonds and cultural expressions. The presence of death influenced art, literature, and daily conversation, reflecting a society deeply aware of life's fragility. Yet, amidst this grim reality, Victorian death culture also provided a framework for hope and meaning. The afterlife, shaped by Christian doctrine, promised reunion with loved ones and eternal peace. This hope was vital to endure the frequent losses that punctuated everyday life. Still, fear lingered, fear of eternal damnation, of restless spirits, and of the unknown beyond death. The tension between faith and fear fueled many of the customs and beliefs of the era. Historians still argue whether Victorian societies' elaborate death rituals were a healthy coping mechanism or a manifestation of a morbid obsession. Were these customs ways to manage grief and loss, or were they part of a cultural fixation on mortality that permeated every aspect of life? What remains undeniable is that death was not hidden away, but lived alongside the living, shaping how Victorians saw themselves and their place in the world. Tonight, as you continue through this journey, you'll glimpse the raw, often unsettling reality of death in Victorian times. Reality where life and death intertwined in ways both beautiful and haunting. The morning mist still clings to the cobblestones. As you prepare to step into a world where mourning is not just a private feeling, but a public, highly codified performance. In Victorian society, grief was dressed in black from head to toe, from the smallest accessory to the most elaborate gown. Mourning customs governed every aspect of life after loss, creating a rigid framework that dictated how one should behave, what to wear, and even how long one should grieve. Black crepe fabric was the material of choice for mourning clothes, its matte, dull surface reflecting the somber mood expected of the bereaved. For women, mourning attire was especially elaborate and prolonged. Widows might wear full mourning for up to 2 years, including multiple stages of mourning dress, each with its own rules. The first, or deep mourning, called for heavy, concealing garments, veils, and minimal decoration. As time passed, women transitioned into half mourning, allowing for softer fabrics and hints of color, but never bright or cheerful. This visible display of sorrow was not just personal, it was a social obligation. Wearing the correct mourning attire demonstrated respect for the deceased and adherence to social norms. Mourning jewelry became another poignant element of Victorian death culture. Jet black, glossy gemstone formed from fossilized wood was popular for mourning rings, brooches, and necklaces. Some pieces even contained locks of the deceased's hair woven into intricate patterns as a tangible keepsake. These pieces were both a personal memento and a public sign of mourning, worn with pride and sorrow. Wearing such jewelry allowed the living to keep their lost loved ones close, a constant reminder of their memory amid daily life. The rituals surrounding mourning extended beyond clothing and jewelry. Public displays of grief were expected, and social etiquette dictated how mourners should behave in public and private. Expressing one's sorrow openly was encouraged. Tears, black clothing, and solemn comportment all signaled the depth of grief. Yet this expression was also tightly controlled. Excessive or inappropriate displays could lead to social censure. Mourning was a balance between heartfelt sorrow and maintaining dignity and respectability in society's eyes. Funerals themselves were grand affairs, particularly among the upper classes. Elaborate processions, often involving hired mourners or professional death mourners who wailed and sobbed loudly, punctuated the somber day. The procession to the cemetery was a public spectacle where family and friends demonstrated their respect and love. Coffins were often ornately decorated, and the deceased dressed in their finest clothes. In some cases, death masks were made, plaster casts of the face of the departed, to preserve their visage in death. The rituals surrounding funerals were as much about honoring the dead as about asserting social status and community bonds. But these customs weren't static. They evolved over the Victorian era, influenced by changing social attitudes, religious beliefs, and technological advances. The strict mourning codes relaxed somewhat by the late 19th century, and practices like half-mourning allowed the bereaved to slowly re-enter society while still respecting their loss. Mourning etiquette was a language in itself, communicating the mourner's relationship to the deceased, their social position, and their emotional state. Historians still argue whether Victorian mourning customs were genuine expressions of grief, or socially imposed performances designed to display status and propriety. Were these elaborate rituals a way to cope with loss, or were they a form of social control, keeping people bound by rigid expectations? The truth likely lies somewhere in between. Mourning was both deeply personal and inherently public, a ritual that helped Victorians navigate the pain of death while maintaining their place in society. Tonight, as you think about these customs, imagine the weight of those heavy black dresses, the delicate mourning jewelry. Victorian mourning was not just a way to mark an ending, it was a culture built around remembrance, respect, and the ever-present shadow of death. As the evening fog drifts through the gaslit streets, and post-mortem portraiture. This may sound macabre, but for Victorians, capturing the image of the departed was a profound way of preserving memory and confronting mortality. Remember, this was an era before affordable color photography or widespread family albums, so a photograph was a precious keepsake. A tangible connection to those lost. Post-mortem photography involved carefully arranging the deceased, often with open eyes or posed in lifelike positions, to create a final portrait that preserved their presence in the world of the living. Families would commission photographers to capture these somber images, displaying them in homes alongside portraits of the living. Sometimes the deceased would be posed with family members, creating haunting group photos where the dead and alive appeared side by side. It was a way to keep the memory of a loved one fresh, and in an era when life expectancy was low, these photographs became treasured mementos. This practice might seem unsettling or even creepy by modern standards. Photographing the dead was not about fascination with death alone, but about preserving love and memory in a tangible form. of infant and childhood mortality. The permanence of a photograph helped families process grief with mortality. It was a culture that tried to domesticate death, bringing it into the home and everyday life. By capturing images of the dead, Victorians asserted control over the chaos of death and the uncertainty of the afterlife. They made death a part of life's visual narrative, blending sorrow with an enduring presence. The photographic studios where these portraits were taken were often specialized and carefully prepared for the task. Photographers became skilled at arranging bodies and lighting to create a serene, almost peaceful appearance. Artistic choices show how Victorians balanced their grief with an attempt to preserve dignity and beauty. Even in death, beyond family keepsakes, death photography also intersected with Victorian spiritualism. Many believed that the soul lingered after death, and that photographs could capture a glimpse of the otherworldly. There were instances where faint, ghostly images appeared in photos, fueling popular fascination with spirits and the supernatural. This phenomenon led to widespread debate and intrigue. Were these spirits truly captured on film, or were they photographic errors and illusions? Interest in seances and mediums. Historians still debate the cultural meaning and psychological impact of post-mortem photography. Some see it as a compassionate and practical means of preserving memory in a time of frequent loss, while others view it as a morbid obsession with death and an attempt to deny its finality. Regardless, the practice reveals a society deeply engaged with mortality and memory, negotiating the boundaries between life, death, and remembrance. As you imagine holding a faded, sepia-toned photograph of a loved one who has passed, their eyes seemingly alive, you get a glimpse of how Victorian culture sought to reconcile the permanence of death with the desire to keep the dead close. These photographs were not just pictures, they were bridges between worlds, tokens of enduring love and loss in an age where death was both feared and intimately familiar. The dawn breaks over Victorian England, and with it comes the ever-present influence of religion on how the living perceive death and the afterlife. Christianity, the dominant faith of the era, provided the framework through which Victorians understood what happens after death. To you, as a Victorian living in this world, the promise of resurrection, eternal life, and reunion with loved ones offered hope amid the omnipresence of loss. Yet these beliefs were layered with anxiety, doctrine, and a strict moral code that shaped not just what happened after death, but how you lived your life. Christianity, during the Victorian era, was steeped in the promise of salvation and the judgment of the soul. The idea of heaven and hell was a powerful motivator. Live a virtuous life, and your soul would be rewarded with eternal bliss. Stray into sin, and you risked eternal damnation. This belief made death a moment of both hope and terror. The afterlife was not just a distant mystery, but a consequence of earthly conduct, constantly reminding Victorians of their moral responsibilities. Your every action, from charity to piety to sexual behavior, was believed to affect your eternal fate. Churches were central to Victorian life, especially in matters of death. They provided space for communal mourning, held funerals, and offered rituals to aid the soul's journey. The Christian funeral service was filled with symbolism and scripture, reinforcing beliefs about the afterlife and the hope of resurrection. You might hear readings from the Book of Revelation or the Psalms, each reinforcing the narrative of death as a passage rather than an end. Hymns and prayers sought to comfort the bereaved and guide the departed soul toward salvation. This strong religious framework also shaped Victorian attitudes towards the body after death. The belief in bodily resurrection led to particular care in burial practices. You would want to ensure that your body was laid to rest properly in consecrated ground to await the resurrection on Judgment Day. This meant that cemetery grounds were sacred spaces, and unmarked or improper burials were seen as not only disrespectful but spiritually perilous. The importance placed on burial rites and graveyards reflected the deep intertwining of faith and death. Yet, beneath this orthodox Christianity, other religious ideas and interpretations flourished. Some Victorians clung to more literal interpretations of the Bible, believing in a physical resurrection and a very defined heaven and hell. Others embraced more metaphorical or hopeful views, seeing death as a transition to a spiritual existence, free from earthly suffering. This diversity of belief led to varied practices and attitudes toward death and mourning. The religious influence also extended into daily life through rituals and symbols. Objects like crosses, prayer books, and religious icons were often kept in the home, especially in the room of the deceased. The fear of eternal separation from God was real and palpable. This Christian view of death coexisted with emerging scientific discoveries and secular philosophies that began to challenge traditional beliefs. The Victorian era was a time of immense change. Darwin's theory of evolution, advances in medicine, and shifts in philosophical thought all stirred debates about the nature of life, death, and what might come after. While religion remained dominant, many Victorians found themselves grappling with these new ideas, searching for answers in a world where faith and science sometimes seemed at odds. Historians still argue over the extent to which Victorian religion truly comforted the masses or fueled anxieties about death and the afterlife. Some suggest that religious doctrine provided a necessary structure for coping with loss, giving hope and meaning. Others believe it heightened fears of judgment and damnation, creating a culture where death was both sacred and terrifying. The truth is likely a mixture of both, a complex dance between faith, fear, and the human desire for understanding. As you walk through this world shaped by faith, rituals, and a search for meaning, you realize that Victorian death culture was inseparable from religion. It was the lens through which life was interpreted, death confronted, and the afterlife imagined. The hope of heaven, the fear of hell, and the promise of resurrection were not abstract ideas. They were lived experiences, shaping the way Victorians mourned, remembered, and ultimately hoped. As twilight deepens, a different kind of curiosity stirs in Victorian England, fascination with the supernatural. Spiritualism, a movement that captured the imagination of many during the 19th century, emerged as a bridge between skepticism and faith, science and superstition. For you, living in this era, seances and mediums might not seem so far-fetched. They are part of a wider cultural attempt to grapple with the mysteries of death and what lies beyond. Spiritualism began in the 1840s and quickly spread across England and America, appealing to people eager to connect with lost loved ones. Seances became social events where mediums claimed to communicate with spirits, delivering messages from the afterlife. These gatherings could be intimate or public, ranging from small parlor meetings to large theatrical performances. As you enter a dimly lit room with candles flickering and a circle of attendees holding hands, you feel the tension between hope and skepticism hanging in the air. The appeal of spiritualism was powerful. It offered comfort to those grieving, the possibility of proof that death was not an end, and a way to bypass traditional religious doctrines that some found too rigid or unsatisfying. Mediums used various techniques: table tipping, spirit writing, automatic writing, and even physical manifestations like rappings and knocks to convince participants that they were in contact with the spirit world. The thrill of potentially hearing a lost loved one's voice or receiving guidance from beyond the grave drew many Victorians into the fold. Yet spiritualism was controversial. The scientific community was divided, with many labeling mediums as frauds or charlatans preying on the vulnerable. Famous investigators like Harry Houdini later exposed many fraudulent mediums, showing how illusions and trickery could mimic spiritual phenomena. Despite this, spiritualism retained a large following, partly because it addressed the emotional needs of the bereaved in a way that orthodox religion sometimes failed to do. Victorian spiritualism was also intertwined with broader social and political movements. Many spiritualists were women, who found in the movement a rare platform for public participation and leadership. The spiritualist belief in the equality of souls after death challenged traditional gender and class hierarchies, making it appealing to progressive thinkers. The movement also intersected with abolitionism, women's suffrage, and other reform causes. Linking the quest for spiritual truth with social justice, the cultural fascination with the supernatural extended into popular literature and art, which often featured ghosts, haunted houses, and mysterious apparitions. Gothic novels, such as those by Mary Shelley and Bram Stoker, tapped into the Victorian obsession with death and the unknown, blending horror with deep philosophical questions about mortality and the soul. These stories both reflected and fueled public fascination with the afterlife, keeping the question of what comes next alive in the popular imagination. Historians still debate the role spiritualism played in Victorian society. Was it primarily a sincere religious movement seeking to understand the afterlife, or was it largely escapism and exploitation? Some argue that spiritualism was a critical cultural response to the trauma of mass death, providing psychological solace and social connection. Others view it as a symptom of a society struggling to reconcile scientific progress with traditional beliefs. For you, as a Victorian, spiritualism offered a tantalizing glimpse beyond the veil of death, a chance to bridge the divide between the living and the dead. Whether through genuine belief or the desire for comfort, seances and mediums became a significant part of Victorian death culture, symbol of hope, mystery, and the enduring human desire to know what lies beyond. As the candles flicker and the seance circle tightens, you feel the weight of centuries of grief and hope pressing in, a testament to humanity's eternal struggle with the mysteries of death and the afterlife. The sun sinks low over the Victorian skyline, casting long shadows on streets where death's presence weaves itself through literature as vividly as through everyday life. For you, death isn't just an abstract event. It's a theme echoing through the novels and poems that capture the imagination and fears of the age. Victorian literature is drenched in the language of mortality, grief, and the afterlife, reflecting society's uneasy relationship with death and the hope for something beyond. Authors like Alfred Lord Tennyson, Christina Rossetti, and Robert Browning poured their sorrows and contemplations into verse that mourned lost loves and meditated on eternal rest. Tennyson's In Memoriam, written over 17 years after the death of his close friend Arthur Hallam, explores grief's transformative power and the possibility of reunion in the afterlife. His words, filled with both anguish and faith, resonated with a public all too familiar with loss. You might find yourself reading these poems, feeling the raw pain and tentative hope woven into every line, understanding that grief was a universal experience in Victorian society. Novels, too, became a canvas for Victorian anxieties about death and what follows. Gothic literature thrived in this environment, with works like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and Bram Stoker's Dracula blending horror with existential questions. These stories weren't just entertainment, they mirrored contemporary fears about science's role in disrupting natural order and the unknown territories of death and immortality. Characters haunted by ghosts or grappling with supernatural forces revealed society's ongoing struggle with mortality, faith, and the afterlife. Children's literature was no exception. The era's fascination with death permeated stories meant for young readers, often containing moral lessons about life, death, and virtue. Stories of angels, lost innocence, and celestial realms shaped children's understanding of death as a passage to a better place. This infusion of death into education and storytelling reflected the Victorian belief in preparing children for life's inevitable end with both realism and comfort. The pervasive presence of death in literature also shaped social attitudes. Mourning, melancholy, and the sublime became fashionable emotional states, influencing how Victorians expressed grief publicly. The literary glorification of sorrow helped normalize the extensive mourning rituals and the cultural value of loss. Writing about death was not just an artistic endeavor, was a social necessity, a way to process collective trauma. However, not all Victorian literature depicted death with solemnity or faith. Some works offered critical perspectives on religious dogma and social expectations surrounding death and mourning. Writers like Oscar Wilde used wit and irony to challenge the era's conventions, questioning the sincerity and rigidity of mourning practices. Still debate the extent to which Victorian literature shaped public attitudes, death, or merely reflected existing beliefs. Was literature a mirror of societal anxieties or a force that shaped them? The answer is likely complex. Literature both influenced and was influenced by Victorian culture, creating a feedback loop of mourning, hope, and fear. As you turn the pages of a worn Victorian novel or recite a mournful poem, you are participating in a long tradition of grappling with mortality through art. These works offer a window into the Victorian soul, a mixture of sorrow, faith, skepticism, and longing that continues to echo through time. Death was not just an end, but a theme that shaped the very stories Victorians told about themselves and their place in the universe. The evening shadows lengthen as you wander through the Victorian cemeteries, gardens of stone and silence, where death is etched in symbolism as much as in flesh. Here, funerary art becomes a language in eloquent conversation between the living and the dead, steeped in allegory and metaphor. Each monument, each carving, tells a story not just of a person, but of Victorian attitudes toward mortality, remembrance, and the afterlife. Gravestones and memorials were often adorned with symbols intended to convey messages of hope, mourning, and eternal life. The willow tree, its branches drooping like sorrow itself, symbolized mourning and grief. The anchor, a steadfast symbol, suggested hope and salvation, a safe harbor for the soul's journey. Broken columns represented lives cut short, while clasped hands carved in stone spoke of the unbroken bond between the living and the dead. These images were not random. They formed a carefully curated visual vocabulary understood by those who visited these sacred spaces. Victorians invested great care into funerary art as an extension of mourning rituals. Families often commissioned intricate monuments and sculptures to honor their loved ones, transforming cemeteries into public galleries of grief and memory. The elaborate symbolism served as a comfort to the bereaved, affirming beliefs in the soul's immortality and the hope of reunion. In this way, cemeteries became places of both sorrow and solace, where art and faith intertwined. The design of cemeteries themselves reflected changing attitudes toward death. The garden cemetery movement of the early 19th century, inspired by ideas from France and England, created peaceful, park-like spaces where the dead could rest in beauty and the living could find comfort in nature. These cemeteries were designed for reflection and remembrance, with winding paths, lush greenery, and ornamental monuments. They represented a shift away from crowded churchyards and toward a more personalized and serene approach to death. But the symbolism in funerary art also hinted at the underlying Victorian anxieties about mortality. The omnipresence of death symbols like skulls, hourglasses, and the Grim Reaper reminded visitors of the inevitability of death and the fleeting nature of life. These memento mori, remember, you must die, served as moral reminders to live virtuously and prepare for the afterlife. Among the more unusual motifs were images of angels, often depicted as guardians guiding the soul to heaven. Cherubs symbolized innocence and purity, especially on children's graves. These figures expressed the Victorian desire to soften the harsh realities of death, especially when it involved young lives. Their presence conveyed reassurance that death was not an end, but a transition to a better place. Yet, funerary art was not just about hope and mourning. It also reflected social status and family pride. Wealthy families used grand monuments and elaborate designs to demonstrate their social position and perpetuate their legacy. The cemetery thus became a place where class distinctions were immortalized in stone, with the grandeur of monuments often correlating with the status of the deceased. Historians still debate how much Victorian funerary symbolism was shaped by popular religious beliefs versus artistic trends and social pressures. Some suggest that the symbols were deeply meaningful spiritual expressions, while others argue they were also fashionable motifs influenced by contemporary art movements. Regardless, the language of funerary art was a powerful way Vic communicated with death and with each other. As you trace the carved stone of a Victorian gravestone, running your fingers over the delicate willow or the solemn angel, you feel the layered emotions embedded in these memorials. They are testaments to grief, hope, fear, and love, all wrapped in stone. Victorian funerary art is more than decoration. It's a window into how a society coped with the most universal and profound experience of all loss. The soft morning light filters through the curtains as you awaken to the distinct, quiet world of Victorian mourning, a world where women bore a unique and profound burden. In Victorian England, the role of women in mourning was not only socially mandated, but culturally monumental. You, as a Victorian woman, are expected to embody the very essence of grief and loss, becoming both a symbol and steward of memory within your family and society. Mourning was a near constant state for many women during this era. With high mortality rates, it was not uncommon for women to spend significant portions of their lives in some stage of mourning, especially if widowed. Mourning attire for women was elaborate and strict, consisting of heavy black dresses, veils, gloves, and accessories that signaled their status to the world. These outward signs of grief were as much about social signaling as they were about personal sorrow. The attire was a public statement, communicating respect for the deceased and the mourners' fidelity to their memory. But beyond the garments, women's roles during mourning extended into managing funeral arrangements, caring for the household in the absence of the deceased, and guiding younger family members through their grief. Widows often became the matriarchs of the family, tasked with preserving the family's honor and traditions amidst loss. Their strength was both a source of comfort and a social necessity. The emotional toll on Victorian women was immense. The constant presence of death in daily life, coupled with societal expectations to express grief openly, yet with dignity, created a complex emotional landscape. Women were expected to be both sorrowful and composed, embodying the ideal of the grieving widow who mourned deeply but gracefully. This performance of grief was a form of social control, ensuring that mourning adhered to accepted norms. Mourning also became a site of female solidarity and community. Women gathered for mourning visits, shared stories of the deceased, and supported each other through their losses. These social networks provided emotional support and reinforced social bonds, creating spaces where grief could be shared and managed collectively. Mourning was both an individual and communal experience, deeply embedded in the fabric of Victorian society. Interestingly, children's deaths elicited some of the most intense mourning responses. Mothers who lost children often went through extended periods of mourning, reflecting both the depth of personal loss and the cultural importance placed on childhood innocence. Memorials for children were common, with elaborate gravestones and sometimes even photographs to preserve their brief presence. Historians still argue about the psychological impact of Victorian mourning customs on women. Some suggest that these rituals provided structure and solace in the face of pervasive death, while others argue that the rigid expectations might have intensified grief and isolation. Regardless, it is clear that Victorian mourning culture was a defining experience for many women, shaping their lives and identities. As you step into the shoes of a Victorian woman navigating loss, you encounter a world where mourning was a public duty, a personal struggle, and a source of social identity. Your grief is both your own and a reflection of your place within a society that reveres the memory of its dead and demands the solemn respect of its living. The soft light of dawn touches the Victorian home, where the presence of children is both a blessing and a source of profound anxiety. As you move quietly through the nursery, your thoughts turn to one of the era's greatest sorrows, the high rate of childhood mortality. For Victorian families, the death of a child was an all-too-common tragedy, a wrenching heartbreak woven into the fabric of daily life. You learn early that children are fragile, and in a world before modern medicine, diseases like measles, diphtheria, and scarlet fever often claimed young lives. Nearly 1 in 4 children would not survive past their 5th birthday. This grim reality shaped not just how families lived, but how they grieved. Mourning children was different. Hope for the child's passage to a better place. Victorian attitudes towards children's souls were influenced heavily by Christian doctrine, which saw children as pure and free from the burden of original sin. This belief provided a measure of comfort. Children who died young were thought to ascend directly to heaven, spared the trials of earthly life and eternal judgment. This theological idea brought a gentle hope to grieving parents, suggesting that their little ones were safe and watched over. The rituals surrounding the death of a child were both tender and elaborate. Families often commissioned ornate memorials, including angelic motifs and imagery of sleep to symbolize innocence and peace. Post-mortem photography was particularly common for children, preserving their fleeting presence in a way that could be cherished forever. These images served as poignant reminders of lost youth and the fragile beauty of life. Yet, the emotional toll on Victorian parents, especially mothers, was immense. The death of a child could trigger extended periods of mourning and profound psychological distress. The social expectation was to grieve openly, yet maintain composure, a balance that was often difficult to sustain. Mothers bore much of the burden, navigating their sorrow while continuing to care for surviving family members. Communities often rallied around families who had lost children, providing support and shared mourning. Children's funerals were significant events, with neighbors and friends participating in the rituals. The collective recognition of loss helped ease the pain and reinforced social bonds. Historians still debate the psychological effects of such high child mortality on Victorian society. Some argue that it fostered resilience and a deep sense of community, while others suggest it perpetuated cycles of grief and anxiety. Regardless, the presence of death among children profoundly shaped Victorian life and culture. As you linger in the nursery's quiet, you feel the bittersweet mixture of joy and sorrow that defined childhood in Victorian England. The ever-present shadow of mortality loomed over innocent laughter, reminding all that life was precious and fragile, and that death, even in its cruelest form, was a part of the human experience. The day unfolds with the relentless precision of Victorian order, and in the midst of it all, you encounter the era's evolving approach to medicine, embalming, and the science of death. In a time when death was common, the burgeoning fields of medical science and funeral practices sought to understand, delay, or at least dignify the passage from life to death. You find yourself in a world balancing superstition with innovation, where doctors, undertakers, and scientists grapple with the mysteries of the human body and the finality of mortality. Victorian medicine was advancing rapidly, but still struggled against diseases that today seem preventable or curable. Doctors used early antiseptics, and public health reforms were beginning to take hold. Yet infections and epidemics remained frequent killers. Medical professionals faced the daunting task of distinguishing between life and death, uncertainty that occasionally led to premature burials. This fear sparked public anxiety and inspired safety coffins equipped with bells or air tubes, devices intended to allow those mistakenly buried alive to signal for help. Embalming, the process of preserving the body after death, gained prominence in Victorian England, especially among the upper classes. Though embalming has ancient roots, Victorian practices evolved alongside new scientific understanding and cultural needs. Embalming provided a way to delay decomposition, allowing for extended mourning periods and more elaborate funerals. It also enabled the display of the deceased in lifelike conditions during post-mortem photography and wakes. Embalming was a delicate art involving the use of chemicals such as arsenic and mercury, substances we now know to be toxic, but then hailed as miraculous preservatives. Undertakers specialized in these techniques, combining scientific knowledge with ritual to prepare the body for its final journey. The care taken in embalming reflected not just respect for the dead, but a desire to deny death's finality, to hold onto life a little longer. Alongside embalming, advances in anatomy and physiology transformed how Victorians understood death. Medical schools began to offer more detailed studies of the human body, and scientific inquiry challenged traditional beliefs about the soul and the afterlife. This shift provoked tension between faith and science, between the desire to control death and the mystery that surrounded it. The role of the undertaker evolved during this time as well. No longer merely coffin makers, their services were a blend of science, ceremony, and commerce, crucial to Victorian death culture. Historians still argue about the degree to which Victorian embalming and medical practices reflected genuine scientific progress versus societal attempts to cope with death. Some see these developments as milestones in public health and mortuary science. Others emphasize the cultural anxieties that drove these practices. As you imagine the process of embalming, the preparation of the body, and the role of the undertaker, you glimpse Victorian society's complex dance with death, a mixture of fear, respect, and the relentless human desire to preserve life's memory. Science and ritual entwined, offering both comfort and confrontation in the face of mortality. The early morning mist wraps itself gently around you as you find yourself wandering through the serene grounds of a Victorian garden cemetery, a place where nature and mourning intertwine in tranquil harmony. The cemetery movement marked a significant shift in how Victorians approached death, not just as an end, but as a part of life worthy of beauty, reflection, and respect. These landscaped burial grounds transformed grim churchyards into peaceful sanctuaries, offering solace to the living and dignity to the dead. Before this movement, many burials took place in overcrowded churchyards within city limits, leading to unsanitary conditions and cramped graves. The rapid growth of urban populations during the Industrial Revolution made these spaces increasingly inadequate and dangerous. Garden cemeteries emerged as a response, designed as expansive, park-like environments on the outskirts of cities. These cemeteries were meticulously planned, with winding paths, ornamental trees, and carefully crafted monuments, blending art and nature. Walking along these paths, you notice the intentional use of symbolism in cemetery design. Trees like cypress, pine, and use symbols of eternal life and mourning the landscape. Gentle hills and meandering streams invite contemplation and peace. The garden cemetery became a place where the living could connect with the dead in a comforting environment, where grief could be experienced amidst natural beauty. These cemeteries also served as social spaces, places for families to visit, picnic, and reflect. They blurred the lines between public parks and burial grounds, allowing the living to integrate mourning into daily life more seamlessly. This was a stark contrast to the earlier, grim, crowded graveyards, and reflected a more modern, comforting approach to death, the elaborate monuments and mausoleums in garden cemeteries speak to Victorian attitudes toward memory and legacy. Families sought to immortalize their loved ones with grand statues, intricate carvings, and personalized epitaphs. These memorials often incorporated Christian symbols, poetic inscriptions, and references to the deceased's virtues and achievements, making each grave a unique narrative of life and death. But the garden cemetery was more than a place of rest. It was a reflection of Victorian values around death, memory, and social status. The design and upkeep of family plots became a way to assert identity and legacy. Visiting the cemetery was as much about reaffirming social bonds and remembering communal ties as it was about personal grief. Historians still debate the garden cemetery's role as both a progressive public health reform and a cultural phenomenon, steeped in social hierarchy and class distinctions. While these cemeteries improved sanitary conditions and provided aesthetic pleasure, they also reinforced social stratifications through monument, grandeur, and plot locations. As you stroll through this peaceful cemetery, you feel the Victorian impulse to transform death from a grim inevitability into a serene, almost pastoral experience. The garden cemetery encapsulates a cultural shift, a desire to reconcile mortality with beauty, memory, and hope. It is a living testament to the Victorian belief could be softened by grace and remembrance. The pale morning light illuminates the stark realities of Victorian society, where death's impact was deeply intertwined with social class. As you walk through the city streets, you notice the contrasting ways in which different social strata confront mortality. Reflection not only of economic disparity, but of cultural attitudes shaped by privilege and hardship. 4. The upper classes' death was managed with ceremony, dignity, and an array of resources. Elaborate funerals were orchestrated with precision, complete with ornate coffins, carriages draped in black, and mourners clad in the latest mourning fashions. The wealthier families could afford burial plots in prestigious cemeteries, monumental tombstones, and personal memorials that ensured their legacy endured. Death was a public affair, a display of status as much as sorrow. In contrast, the working classes faced death with far fewer comforts. Overcrowded housing, poor sanitation, and limited access to medical care meant that death often came swiftly and without warning. Funerals for the poor were simpler, sometimes hurried, and burials took place in mass graves or less maintained parts of cemeteries. And the economic burden of death weighed heavily on families already struggling to survive. Despite these disparities, death served as a great social equalizer. The inevitability of mortality transcended wealth and status, affecting all Victorians in profound ways. However, the manner in which death was experienced, remembered, and ritualized was deeply colored by one's position in society. Social class influenced everything from the care given to the dying, to funeral customs, to the permanence of memorials. This stratification extended to the ways families coped with loss. Wealthier Victorians could employ professional mourners, invest in mourning jewelry, and engage mediums or spiritualists to communicate with the dead. Working-class families often relied on close-knit community support and simpler, yet heartfelt, mourning practices. Both groups shared grief, but their expressions of it were shaped by economic realities and social expectations. The stark differences also played out in the legal and economic aftermath of death. Inheritance laws favored property owners, typically the wealthy, ensuring that wealth and power remained within established families. The poor, with little to inherit, faced not only emotional loss, but often economic ruin. Death could sever the only means of livelihood for many working-class families, forcing survivors into precarious living conditions. Historians still debate the extent to which Victorian death practices reinforced social divisions or provided a means of expressing communal identity across class lines. Some argue that funerary customs were a way to maintain social order, while others suggest that mourning rituals offered a rare space for community solidarity, transcending class boundaries in shared grief. As you navigate this complex social landscape, you see how Victorian death culture was both a reflection of society's inequalities and a shared human experience. Death laid bare the divisions between rich and poor, yet also united all in the universal struggle to find meaning, comfort, and remembrance in the face of loss. The fog hangs heavy over the city as you contemplate Victorian views on euthanasia and suicide, topics often shrouded in taboo and moral judgment, yet quietly present beneath the era's strict social veneer. Death was to be endured with dignity and piety, yet there were those who sought control over their own passing in a society that largely condemned such choices. Euthanasia, or the act of deliberately ending one's life to alleviate suffering, was virtually unheard of in legal or medical practice. But debates about mercy killing occasionally surfaced in Victorian medical journals and philosophical discussions. The prevailing Christian morality strictly opposed any act seen as interfering with God's will, framing life as sacred and death as divine decree. Yet, as medicine progressed and chronic illnesses became more common, questions about compassion and the right to die began to whisper through the drawing rooms and medical circles. Suicide, meanwhile, was legally and socially condemned, seen as both a sin and a crime, denying Christian burial rites and often subjecting the deceased's property to forfeiture. Families of those who died by suicide could face social ostracism, and the act itself was considered a moral failure. Rapid social change. Interestingly, some Victorian thinkers and writers began to challenge the stigma surrounding suicide and euthanasia. Philosophers like John Stuart Mill debated individual autonomy and the right to choose death, while others called for reforms in mental health care and more humane treatment of the suffering. And private spheres, far from mainstream acceptance, public attitudes were often conflicted, mixing horror and pity with fascination. Cases of suicide sometimes became sensational news stories, eliciting both condemnation and sympathy. Literature and art occasionally explored themes of despair and self-destruction. Broader tensions between tradition and modernity. Were these views rigid moral codes protecting social order, or were they challenged by emerging ideas about individual rights and compassion? The conversation, fraught and complex, shows the era grappling with death not just as a fate, but as a question of choice and dignity. As you ponder these difficult topics, and the mercy owed to those enduring unbearable pain, their grappling with euthanasia and suicide reflects a society in transition into the curious and sometimes unsettling world of popular superstitions and taboos surrounding death. This is a realm where fear, folklore, and faith intersect, a shadowy space where the living seek to navigate the mysteries of mortality through rituals. Superstitions from earlier centuries many of which persisted alongside emerging scientific understanding. The significance of certain numbers, or the ominous presence of black cats and ravens. These beliefs provided a way to make sense of the unpredictable nature of death. Similarly, the appearance of a bird, especially a raven or owl, near the house, was often seen as a harbinger of death. Protective rituals carrying charms, avoiding certain actions after dark. For instance, it was considered bad luck to wear mourning clothes inside the home before the funeral, or to begin wearing black before the body was buried. The deceased. Even in death, social norms and superstitions governed behavior rigidly. There were also eerie customs, such as mourning hair. While sentimental, this practice also echoed older beliefs about the power of hair as a connection to the soul. Seances themselves were surrounded by superstition and mystery. Participants often observed strict protocols: no whistling, no coughing, no breaking the circle, to avoid disturbing the spirits, hauntings, or misfortune. Historians debate whether these superstitions were primarily remnants of medieval folklore or adaptations shaped by Victorian anxieties about death and control. Some view them as irrational fears, while others see them as coping mechanisms in an age when death was ever-present and often inexplicable. For you, with mortality's unknowns, these beliefs offered structure in chaos. Death culture was as much about controlling the unknown as it was about mourning the nona, delicate dance of faith, fear, and folklore. The smoky haze of industrial London wraps around you as you navigate the impact of industrialization on Victorian attitudes toward death. Death, once more intimately tied to rural communities and family networks, became a looming presence in the grim, and hazardous working conditions led to alarming death rates, especially among the working class. Epidemics like cholera and tuberculosis. Death was no longer a distant or infrequent visitor. It was an ever-present reality for many. This harsh reality influenced Victorian death rituals and perceptions profoundly. Traditional burial grounds within city limits became overcrowded and unsanitary, leading to public health crises and the rise of new cemetery movements outside the urban core. The garden cemeteries, with their planned landscapes and greenery, were not just aesthetic choices, but public health necessities designed to combat the dangers posed by mass burials. The industrial era also introduced mechanization to death-related industries. Coffin manufacturing, funeral carriages, and embalming techniques became more standardized and commercialized. Undertakers turned into professionals who managed death as a business, navigating the logistics of death in a fast-paced, mechanized society. The funeral industry adapted to serve a growing urban population, increasingly distanced from traditional communities of the countryside. Urban dwellers often faced death with less social support, leading to more private or hurried mourning rituals. Yet, paradoxically, the scale of death in cities also fostered a growing culture of public mourning and memorialization. Death amid factories, dark alleys, and polluted skies. The grim realities of urban death were themes explored in novels and paintings, underscoring the human cost of progress. The contrast between Victorian ideals of death as peaceful and dignified and the brutal realities of industrial mortality created tension and social critique. Historians, destructive or transformative. Some argue it exacerbated social inequalities and dehumanized death, while others see it as a catalyst for public health reforms and new cultural practices that shaped modern approaches to mortality. As you walk through the smoky streets and into the quiet gardens of Victorian cemeteries, you witness a society grappling with the consequences of progress. Industrialization changed not only how Victorians lived, but how they faced death, forcing adaptations that blended tradition with modernity in a world forever altered by the Victorian understanding of grief and the psychology behind mourning. In a society saturated with death, Victorians developed intricate theories and practices for managing loss, a blend of emerging psychological thought and deeply ingrained cultural rituals. A culture striving to make sense of sorrow, balancing public expression with private anguish. Grief in Victorian times was not just an emotional response, but a process laden with societal expectations. Mourning was structured into stages, each with prescribed behaviors and durations, and their communities navigate the complex emotions of loss while maintaining social order. Victorian medical professionals began to study grief as a psychological condition related to bereavement. Treatments ranged from rest cures to herbal remedies, reflecting a growing awareness of the mind-body connection. Letters, diaries, and memoirs from the era revealed deeply personal accounts of grief, illuminating the tension between private pain and public performance. Women, often the primary mourners, wrote extensively about their sorrow, using writing as a therapeutic outlet. These personal narratives offer insight into the complex emotional lives hidden behind Victorian stoicism and etiquette. Religious faith played a dual role in Victorian grief. For many, belief in an afterlife provided comfort and hope, framing death as a temporary separation. Yet, faith also demanded acceptance and restraint, encouraging mourners to temper their sorrow with the assurance of divine will. This interplay shaped the emotional landscape. Lighting candles and attending memorial services served both to honor the dead and to support the living through communal expressions of loss. These practices reinforced bonds and created shared spaces for mourning, essential in a society where death was so prevalent. Historians debate how much Victorian mourning practices helped or hindered emotional healing. Some argue that the structured rituals provided necessary outlets for grief, while others believe they enforced restrictive emotional codes that could prolong suffering. The era's approach to grief reflects a complex negotiation between cultural norms and individual needs. As you immerse yourself in these stories of loss and resilience, you see how Victorians sought not only to survive death, but to understand and live with grief. Their efforts laid early groundwork for modern concepts of bereavement and psychological care, revealing a culture profoundly engaged with the colony emotional toll of mortality. The mid-morning sun highlights the often overlooked yet vital legal and economic dimensions of death in Victorian England. As you step into this intricate world, deeply entwined with inheritance, laws, property rights, and family fortunes, Victorian England's legal system treated death as a moment of transition, not only for the soul, but also for wealth and property. Wills, probate, and inheritance laws dictated how estates were passed on, often preserving wealth within families and maintaining social order. The legal process could be lengthy and complicated, involving executors, trustees, and courts to ensure the deceased's wishes were fulfilled. For the upper classes, managing estates was a matter of preserving family legacy. Primogeniture, right of the eldest son to inherit the entire estate, was the norm, aimed at keeping properties intact across generations. This practice reinforced social hierarchies and maintained wealth concentration, but also sometimes caused tensions within families, especially among daughters and younger sons. The middle and working classes faced different challenges. Many families had little property to pass on, and the death of a breadwinner could plunge survivors into poverty. Insurance and savings became increasingly important, with Victorian society witnessing the rise of life insurance as a means to provide financial security after death. Yet, for many, the economic impact of death was devastating and immediate. Funeral expenses were a significant concern. The cost of coffins, burial plots, mourning attire, and funeral services could strain family finances. Undertakers and coffin makers operated as businesses, and some families went into debt to provide appropriate funerals, reflecting the cultural importance of dignified death rituals. The financial burden often fell heavily on widows and children, who had to navigate both grief and economic hardship. Legal disputes over wills and inheritance were common, sometimes leading to prolonged court battles that added to family distress. Victorian law gradually evolved to address issues of gender and property rights, with married women gaining more legal control over their property by the late 19th century. But many inequalities persisted. Historians debate how Victorian legal and economic practices surrounding death influenced social stability and family dynamics. Some view the system as a means to uphold order and continuity, while others highlight its role in perpetuating inequality and hardship for vulnerable survivors. As you contemplate the intersection of law, money, and mortality, you recognize that death in Victorian England was as much about securing the future as it was about honoring the past. The legal and economic dimensions shaped lives and legacies, influencing how families coped with loss and how society managed the inevitable passage from life to death. The soft twilight descends as you reflect on the legacy of Victorian death. Culture, tracing its profound influence on modern attitudes and practices surrounding mortality. The rituals, beliefs, and innovations born out of Victorian England's complex relationship with death have left an indelible mark on how we understand, mourn, and commemorate those who pass. Victorian mourning attire, once a strict code of black, crepe, and veils, echoes today in the custom of wearing black to funerals, a symbol of respect and sorrow that persists across cultures. The garden cemetery movement revolutionized burial practices, inspiring the creation of park-like memorial spaces worldwide, emphasizing beauty and reflection over mere practicality. These cemeteries transformed death from an isolated event into a communal, contemplative experience. The Victorian fascination with death photography, once a means of preserving memory, has evolved into contemporary memorial photography and the broader cultural engagement with remembrance through images. Spiritualism's quest to connect with the beyond prefigured today's varied beliefs about the afterlife, the paranormal, and the enduring human desire to communicate with lost loved ones. Moreover, Victorian literature's rich exploration of death and mourning has shaped literary traditions, influencing genres such as gothic fiction, horror, and poetic elegy. The era's blend of faith, fear, and fascination continues to resonate in popular culture, film, and art, reminding us of the timeless nature of humanity's struggle with mortality. Yet, the Victorian legacy is not without its shadows. The rigid social codes surrounding mourning, the gendered expectations placed on women, and the disparities in death experiences across social classes have prompted critical reflection on how death intersects with social justice. Modern movements advocating for more personalized, inclusive, and compassionate approaches to death and dying often emerge in response to these historical legacies. Historians still debate the full extent of Victorian death culture's impact, balancing appreciation for its contributions to public health, memorialization, and grief management with critiques of its sometimes oppressive social norms. The complexity of this legacy reflects the multifaceted ways in which death shapes human society. As you ponder the echoes of Victorian death culture in the present, you realize that the past is never truly gone. It lives on in our rituals, our stories, and our ways of coping with loss. The Victorians taught us that death, while universal, is experienced and remembered through deeply personal and cultural lenses, a truth that continues to shape our journey through life and beyond. The soft glow of evening envelops you as you prepare to peel back the layers of myth and reality surrounding Victorian death culture. Popular imagination often paints this era as obsessively morbid, steeped in dark rituals and bizarre practices. But as you look closer, the picture becomes more nuanced. Victorian attitudes toward death were complex, multifaceted, and often misunderstood. Many common perceptions about Victorian mourning are exaggerated or oversimplified. The image of widows, forever clad in heavy black dresses, locked in endless sorrow, overlooks the gradual relaxation of mourning customs over time. By the late 19th century, mourning attire and rituals became less rigid, reflecting changing social norms and practicalities. Similarly, while post-mortem photography was popular, it was not universally practiced or accepted, and often served specific emotional needs rather than widespread obsession. Popular culture has also amplified the era's fascination with spiritualism, portraying seances and mediums as eerie parlor tricks. In reality, spiritualism was a sincere movement for many, offering comfort and hope amid frequent and devastating loss. It also intersected with important social movements, providing a platform for marginalized voices, especially women. Victorian funerary art, often seen as gothic or macabre, was also rich in symbolism and beauty, reflecting deep religious faith and a desire to honor the dead. Garden cemeteries were not just morbid resting places, but community spaces that promoted reflection, health, and memory. Historians caution against viewing Victorian death culture through a purely sensational lens. Instead, they advocate understanding it as a response to real social, economic, and emotional needs, a way for a society grappling with unprecedented mortality rates and rapid change to find order and meaning in loss. This myth-busting perspective reveals a Victorian death culture that was as much about love, remembrance, and resilience as it was about fear and mourning. The rituals and beliefs served to connect the living and the dead, honor memory, and help individuals and communities cope with grief. You gain a deeper appreciation for the Victorian approach to death, a culture marked by humanity's eternal quest to face mortality with dignity, hope, and connection. The night deepens, and as you settle into the quiet, it's time to softly reflect on the complex and profound Victorian relationship with death and the afterlife. The era's customs, beliefs, and rituals were born from a world intimately acquainted with loss, where death was not an exception, but an expectation. Through mourning dresses, garden cemeteries, spiritual seances, seeking meaning, solace, and hope beyond the inevitable, you've traveled through the shadows and light of Victorian death culture balancing fear and faith, science and superstition, public spectacle and private sorrow. The rituals were both a shield against the chaos of loss and a bridge to the promise of an afterlife. Remember and honor those they loved. Now, as your eyelids grow heavy, imagine the soft flicker of candlelight in a quiet parlor, the gentle rustle of black crepe, and the tender words whispered over a grave. The Victorian era teaches us that death, while universal and unyielding, is also deeply personal and shaped by culture, belief, and love. Their legacy reminds us that in facing mortality, humanity crafts rituals that bind us across time and space. Rest now, with the comforting thought that grief and remembrance are part of our shared human story, gently carried forward by each generation. The echoes of Victorian mourning remind us that death, while a closing chapter, is also a doorway into memory, legacy, and, perhaps, something beyond.